bow our heads in prayer. Lord, through the written word and the spoken word, may we now meet the living word. Amen. Amen. It's a tremendous joy and privilege to be with you again, and special joy because all three of our readings today are wonderful readings that one can preach a sermon on any of them. It's a bit difficult, without making it a very long sermon, to preach on all of them because the links between them are not easy and are quite tenuous. So I'm going to excuse me, I'm going to focus on the Old Testament lesson, the story that we all know so well of David and Bathsheba. Let's just follow the story. David, we are told, is on his rooftop and he's looking out across the city, and there he sees a woman. A very, very beautiful woman. And he immediately desires her and takes her. 1, 2, 3. See, desire, take. And if you go back to the story of Eve in the Garden of Eden, that's exactly, in almost the same words, the sequence in the temptation with the fruit. She looked at it, and she saw it was very lovely, and to be greatly desired. And so she took and ate. And then, just a throwaway, she went immediately, having done wrong, and tried to get her husband, successfully, to do the same. So David's story with Bathsheba is actually the story of sin. All sin. Any sin. It's the story that confronts each and every one of us, each and every day of our lives. We are bombarded with advertising that shows us things that are very beautiful and so to be desired that we're tempted to want to take them and have them. And there's nothing wrong in that, is there? Well, yes it is. Because it often takes us in the wrong directions. And certainly, David seeing something that was very beautiful and desiring it and taking it, lands David in a whole lot of trouble. Because you see, she wasn't his for the taking. The story is very clear right at the beginning. When David says, "Who was that woman?" we're told her name, Bathsheba, her father's name and her family name, and her husband's name, and the fact that they were Hittites, converts to Judaism, who had been drawn to Judaism by what they saw amongst the Jewish people. So David takes what is not his, and it lands him in trouble because she falls pregnant. It's been known to happen. And in David's case, in Israel's case, that has hugely serious consequences. For David, it means death. So, what do? You work out a scheme. And David hits on a brilliant scheme. He sends for Uriah to be sent back from fighting battles on some pretext. And then Uriah, having fulfilled the pretext, David says, go and relax, enjoy your wife, have fun. But Uriah doesn't. You see, Uriah takes his faith more seriously than David. Uriah will not do what he shouldn't be doing in a time of battle. He will not lie with his wife. And Uriah deals with it in the way that actually we're all called to deal with it. If you're going to see something beautiful and be tempted and you act on it, don't go there. So he doesn't. He doesn't go to see his wife. Doesn't even wave hello to her. He stays away and avoids the temptation. But that's not quite what David was hoping for, because you see, if Uriah had gone home and he had lain with his wife, then it could easily have been his child and nobody be any the wiser. So David extends it. Stay another day. And he schemes up a second plan. Get him drunk. When you're drunk, your inhibitions tend to slip a bit. And you may end up doing things you might regret, but he'll do it. But Uriah doesn't. He stays away yet again. And so we end the story. We'll find the consequences of it next week. But we end the story with David issuing an instruction to the head of the army. Kill him. Make it look like he was killed in battle, but Uriah has to die. So David moves from something that was bad into something that is evil. And actually the consequence is the total destruction and downfall of David's kingdom. It leads directly on a steady path downwards. It destroys his family, it destroys his children, it destroys his inheritance, it destroys everything, and is directly linked to the break and the split in the kingdom. You see, the truth is, sin isn't a matter of personal decision and consequence. It has huge dimensions that we don't see. And today, where adultery has become commonplace, anyone who's a counsellor will tell you of the consequences on the family. The damage to the wife or the husband, the damage to the children. And the Bible tells us that. The sins of the fathers will be visited upon the children to the third and fourth generation. It's not nothing. It's world-changing. But let's go back to the story of David, because you know the story of David, David's downfall doesn't start there. It's very clear here. But it actually started a couple of weeks ago. A couple of weeks ago we were in church and we had a wonderful story about David bringing the ark to Jerusalem. You remember it? And dancing before the Lord and celebrating. It was a lovely story. But it's only half the story. Because if you read it, you'll discover that the ark had been lying where it had been lying for more than 20 years before David brings it to Jerusalem. So why did he bring it to Jerusalem right then? because it served David's self-interest. It was co-opting God. He wanted to create a place around his own palace where God would be present. Connect God and the kingdom, and David's made for life. And there are a couple of clues of what's happening, because just before the story of dancing before the ark, we're told how David meets with King Hiram of Lebanon. Well, it's to be expected. It's what kings do, isn't it? And they make trade agreements, which is to be expected, because that's exactly what kings were expected to do. There's also another little, perhaps less savoury piece. We're told that David creates a harem of concubines. Definitely not the Jewish way, but very common in the ancient Middle East, and certainly the way all the kings lived and behaved. So David was just being a king, which is actually why the trouble with Bathsheba started. Because being a king, they wouldn't let him go to battle anymore. David, the great warrior, he stays at home while the army goes out to fight for him. That was why he was where he was when he was, and saw what he saw and did what he did. Because he was being king. Now, there's nothing wrong in that, is there? Well, maybe some of you will remember a long time back in our year, we had a reading of Samuel. We had a few readings of Samuel. We began with him as a little boy being dedicated at the temple. Then we had a story of Samuel as a leader when the people came to him and asked for a king. Do you remember that? But I bet you don't remember the words. And yet they are amongst the most important words in the Old Testament. Give us a king, they said, that we might be like other nations. Give us a king that we might be like other nations. And here we are with David, a king, just like the other nations. But you see, my friends, that was exactly what God did not want Israel to be. God did not want Israel to be like other nations. He called Israel to be a chosen people, a holy people, a royal priesthood, who would proclaim the truth of God in a pagan world in such a way that the pagans would be drawn to God. And Uriah the Hittite was an example of it. Israel was not meant to be like other nations. And you see, that's the challenge that confronts us as church in the world today. Because we want to be like all the other people. So we're seduced by the same advertising. You want to be successful? You've got to do this. You've got to have this. You've got to drive the right car. You've got to shop at the right shops and wear the right clothes. My grandchildren will go out and spend more on a pair of shoes than I can buy a whole wardrobe. Mine hasn't got a brand name on it. Theirs has to. Because that's how you measure cool. That's how you measure you belong. That's how you measure you've got status. That's why people buy cars they can't afford. So that they can drive up and down the street and everybody who don't know who they are could look at them and say, wow. And he's still so young. It's beautiful to behold. It's greatly to be desired, and I must have it at all costs. And we want to be like that. But the church was called, like Israel, not to be like the other nations. Paul is very clear. We're aliens in a foreign land. We don't belong. We may be in this world, but we're not called to live like this world. And when we do, we get caught up in the same mess. Because, yes, the world may not care if we commit adultery, but God does. And your children do. And your children's children will pay the price too. Because we wreak damage. We undermine the way God's kingdom was meant to be. So instead of building kingdom, we break kingdom. Give us a king that we might be like all the nations. No. People of God, no. And that's what Paul is saying in today's letter to the Ephesians. He's praying that they will not be like the people around him. Be different. The church grew rapidly in its first 300 years. And I wonder if you ever stop to wonder why. They never had a beautiful church like St. Thomas's. They didn't have a church at all for the first 300 years. It was forbidden religion. So they didn't have a church. They didn't have a choir. They didn't have beautiful church music and wonderful organs. They didn't have a mothers' union. They actually just met in people's homes, in secret. You know those people who welcome you when you come to church, the size persons? That goes right back to the very early church. But do you know that what's changed? When you come to church here, at least I hope, the sidesman says, "How lovely to see you. It's so nice to see you again. Thank you for coming." In the early church, the sidesman was a god. No one was allowed into the church who wasn't a member. You didn't belong, you got turned away. Why? Because it's life-threatening. You come to church, oh, okay, and I'll tell on all of you tomorrow and see what happens to you next week. He was a god to keep, to say, unbelievers out. So how did the church grow at all? And the answer is simple. They were different. See how these Christians love one another, said one of the early church leaders to the emperor. Look, you don't see love like this in the world. They are something different. See how different they are. I wonder what people would say if I went out in the street and said, "Come inside here and see just how different these people are from you." But that's what we're called to be. Radically different. And I want to end with something that I think God gave to me in the middle of the night. If it's not, you can ignore it. It's just a very quick closing story about a Christian man who, at the age of 3, went with his mother, who was a midwife, to the birth of a baby, little baby girl. He wasn't in the room. He just heard the baby cry. Its first cry. But I guess, being 3 years old, he didn't remember it terribly well. And it wasn't terribly important. He certainly had nothing to do with her, even though she was on a neighboring farm. Little boys don't like little girls terribly much, especially when they're very small. And when there's 3 years difference, even less. But came the day when she was probably about 16 or 17, when he bumped into her. Don't know that he was standing on his roof. But he looked at her and he saw a woman beautiful to behold, just like Bathsheba. And like David, he looked and said, wow, isn't she desirable? Unlike David, he didn't act on it. But he did go home. Well, actually, that's not true. He did. Apparently, he invited her out to go to the movies. But he didn't act in any other way. But he did go home that evening and tell his parents he'd met the girl he was going to marry. And surprise, surprise, was that little girl. He did get married to her. She wasn't yet 20. He was just over 20. And they got married and set up home and were deeply religious, as their parents were. Part of a church that had Sunday school for adults as well as children, and they taught in the Sunday school for the kids and went to Sunday school for themselves. They were very active in the church all through their life. Taught Sunday school until very old. They also belonged to a church that once a year went out on a mission. They used to go and build houses for the poor. And they all went as a family. Husband, wife, the kids. And they built houses, physically nailed the nails in the wood and did the whole thing. Every year. Be surprised to know the last time he went, he was already in his 90s. And he still went and nailed nails. His wife, towards the end of her life, developed Alzheimer's. Had to be hospitalized in a special home. And he admitted himself into the same home. Didn't have Alzheimer's, but he admitted himself because he wanted to be with her, because they were to be together all their life. She died a couple of years ago. He's still alive. They were married for, I should have gone home and checked it up, I didn't know it at the last service either, 71 or 77 years, I'm not sure, which is pretty well something of a record. Even more of a record is they've known each other for over 90 years. That's quite something. And in those 90 years, he never looked at another woman. She never looked at another. Oh, they might have looked. But certainly they never touched. You probably don't know who I'm talking about, so I'll tell you. President Jimmy Carter of the United States of America. At one time, the most powerful man in the world, because he was the leader of the most powerful country in the world. But he never stopped teaching Sunday school. And he never stopped taking an annual vacation to go and build houses for the poor. Right through his presidency. Amazing. He was also one of the few presidents who didn't win a second term. And he didn't win a second term. You know why? Because he was too honest. He lived such a Christian life that the Americans said, you don't know how to play politics. You don't know how to lie. You don't know how to be dishonest and deceive people and spin the story. And so he wasn't re-elected, and he went home to his old farm, to the same house they'd lived in all their lives, and he just carried on being a Christian. And I want to tell you, I personally think that he's one of the great American presidents. Because he was honest. Because he set an example in a world that doesn't understand godliness. He lived God in everything. He didn't desire what the world desired. He wanted only God's kingdom, here on earth, even as it is in heaven. And that's the challenge for you and me. Are you going to be world's people or God's people? because they're not the same. Amen.